Gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, thank you all for staying. Are you all here to hear about hydrogen, right? Let's hear it for hydrogen. Alrighty, that's the enthusiasm that we love here at the BC Natural Resources Forum. So it's just a reminder that we use Hoover for our audience questions, and you know how to work that technology. You've been doing it well for a couple of days, and I know you have all stayed to hear about the great future of this new industry for British Columbia. So let's jump in and get right to it, eh? And don't be afraid, you don't have to wait to ask questions. Get on Hoover, because I know our moderator is gonna have a few questions of his own for his panel. Our moderator this afternoon then for the panel Hydrogen, Now and to the Future. Please give a warm BC Natural Resources Forum welcome for Matthew Klippenstein, Executive Director of Hydrogen BC. Give it up, and you're good.
Hello, okay. Thank you very much. So I'm Matthew Klippenstein with the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Association. I lost my voice in the past 36 hours. I'll struggle through as best I can. I do want to, for this panel, I want to introduce our speakers first, super briefly. Then we'll each have a little bit of an explanation of what their individual activities are in energy and hydrogen. And from there, we'll alternate between Hoover questions and the other questions I'd prepped priorhand. So first, we have Neil Dobson, Chief Sustainability Officer with Hydrogen Naturally. Next, we have Jessica Verhagen, Chief Executive Officer of Hydra Energy Corp. Joe Mazza, Vice President, Energy Supply and Resource Development for Fortis BC. And Mary Fry, Director of Production Assets for HTEC. So Neil, do you want to just speak for a couple minutes about yourself and the company?
Thanks, Matthew, and good afternoon, everybody. Hydrogen Naturally is a new organization. We have a couple of partners, Peak Renewables, that's a forestry business, part of the Brian Fair Group, and Northwest Capital Partners, who built the Sturgeon Refinery and the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. So across that, we have expertise on the forestry side, expertise on the hydrogen, the carbon capture side, and with the First Nation, Fort Nelson First Nation, we also have a partnership with the forestry side there. So our business model is to utilize forestry residuals, the stuff that gets left behind after the saw log and the pulp logs come out to go to those higher value usages, convert that into hydrogen and carbon dioxide through a gasification process. So we take the forestry residuals out, we pelletize those, and then we move those to a central hydrogen and carbon capture hub. Critically, because we're actually capturing the carbon that was in the tree, putting that underground, the hydrogen we produce actually is negative emission, somewhere between -10 and -40 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So this is a relatively new concept in terms of this biomass to hydrogen pathway. And we're going to try and get that going. We're in the fundraising and financing process. Our team is proven, the technology is proven, it's high TRL, so we've got no concerns about getting there. We hope to be up and running in 2027, actually producing hydrogen.
That's fantastic. Please excuse me again. So going from the hydrogen supply side to a use case for hydrogen, Jessica, do you want to speak to Hydra Energy for a bit?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Matthew, and thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. And thanks for having me here in Prince George. This is an especially fond place for Hydra because we had our start testing our technology here in Prince George since 2016. We're a clean technology company based in British Columbia. We have a retrofit kit that we use to convert existing diesel trucks to run off a blend of hydrogen and diesel. It's co-combustion, it's not a fuel cell. And again, it's just a pleasure to be here in Prince George where we've been testing on trucks in real commercial routes with real commercial drivers, fully loaded up to the weight max. It's given us the testing that we need to prove to fleets that the technology gets the performance that they'd expect out of diesel, but with a blend of hydrogen, works in cold temperatures. We've had minus 46 degrees so far. It's been our coldest in Prince George. Thank you very much. And we've gotten our kilometers up to 1,000 kilometers round trip. So we do focus in Prince George here on return to base fleets that will be serviced by our station that we broke ground with many of you. Thank you for coming and supporting us in September. So when we broke ground on that site, it was both for a hydrogen refueling station that'll fill over 65 trucks just in the southern part of Prince George. And it'll be open a year from now in 2024. And we also have hydrogen production on the site. So we're producing and consuming locally. The production is from electrolysis, where we pull down from BC Hydro's grid. And we've been really happy with the partnerships that we've been able to build with the City of Prince George and the support of so many of you to bring this project to fruition. I'll just quickly talk about the truck conversion to give you a better picture of what goes on. It's a 2-day conversion, so we're only looking at taking a truck out of a fleet for 2 days. And then we've partnered with First Truck, who has actually 2 locations here in Prince George. They're Canada's largest Daimler dealer, and they'll be doing our conversions for us. So we can scale faster. Again, it just comes down for us to partnerships, and the more we can work together, the faster we can make more happen. So with that, thank you again for having me, and thanks to Matthew for coordinating the panel.
Thank you, Jessica. Go voice, go. Okay, so next up, we have Joe Mazza from Fortis, BC. So we've heard from supply, and we've heard from demand or consumption. Fortis has a very comprehensive decarbonization strategy for the next 7 years now, I guess, of which hydrogen is part. And so perhaps not just on the infrastructure side, but also on the sourcing side, perhaps you can just reintroduce this aspect of Fortis BC to us and the audience.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and I also really appreciate being at the BC Resources Forum here in Prince George with fellow panelists, so thank you very much. So just a bit of background on Fortis and what we've been up to at Fortis BC. I think everybody knows this probably as a natural gas electricity provider, district energy as well. We deliver safe, reliable, cost-effective energy to 1.2 million customers in British Columbia, in 135 communities, and 58 First Nations communities across 150 traditional territories in our portfolio. We've got a fair amount of infrastructure, over 50,000 kilometers of gas lines in the system that we're excited about using and repurposing for clean energy, and we've started down that journey. Our priorities really align with our clean growth pathway, which we do have clean emissions. We've got targets for 2030. We've got long-term targets as well. And it's about really using that gas and electric infrastructure together, working on our efficiency programs, our renewable gas programs, zero and low carbon transportation, and LNG. And while we're working on our hydrogen, we've been at it for about 5 years, quite focused on hydrogen. We've been at renewable gas a little bit longer. Right now, we're about 10% of our supply now is contracted for renewable gas. So we've been at this journey over 10 years, and if all that renewable gas comes on over the next couple of years, if these projects get constructed, as we hope, we're going to be at enough gas to heat 320,000 homes. So that's exciting. I'd say a big part of what we're up to is to ensure a cost-effective energy transition as well. And that is a gargantuan task. We need to work hard to try to deliver service to our customers cost-effectively and deliver the customer service that we've been used to providing. And for example, we've got a tariff application in front of the BC Utilities Commission right now where all new residential customer connections will receive 100% renewable gas for the life of their buildings if approved. So these are the types of things we're working on. On the hydrogen side, we've got a number of pilot projects. We have got doing a lot of work on codes and standards. We're doing an integrated study across our system on the readiness of hydrogen into the system. And I'll talk more about some of the kind of infrastructure projects that we have in development shortly. But for us, it's really around achieving the decarbonization goals, which by 2030 utilities have a mandate to have 47% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a big task, but we're up to it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe. Now, having covered supply, infrastructure, as well as consumption, Mary is the perfect person to go next, as HTEC is involved in each of these. So do you want to speak a little bit to reintroduce HTEC to the audience and yourself?
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, I'm the Director of Production Assets at HTEC. I work in our Clean Fuels group, and we work across the entire hydrogen value chain. Our focus is on the transportation market and enabling it to transition to a cleaner, low-carbon future. The company is structured into 4 business units. I'm in the Clean Fuels, and our focus is on developing, building, owning, and operating production and liquefaction assets. We have several projects in development in BC and as well as across the country, and these are hydrogen electrolysis projects, so we are leveraging renewables and clean energy, so BC is the perfect location with the clean grid so that we can develop clean hydrogen. Recently, HTEC announced an agreement with ERCO to co-locate a 15-ton per day liquefier in North Vancouver, where we will use the byproduct hydrogen from their operations and liquefy it. And so all of this production and liquefaction will be critical in supplying our expanding network of refueling stations. Our stations and distribution group is focused on developing, building, and owning and operating fueling stations. And currently we have 3 operating stations in Vancouver, 1 on the island in Victoria, and another in Quebec. We have several more, well, many more in both the planning and the development stages. Our next station will be opening in Kelowna. It's currently in the commissioning phases. So all of these stations that are operating are for light-duty passenger vehicles. But as we go through the planning and developing phase now, we are focused on heavy-duty as well as light-duty fueling, because the application of hydrogen in heavy-duty applications has much more impact on reducing GHG emissions, and we see a much bigger hydrogen play there. And so our third business unit is our transportation solutions, and this is where we actually work with medium and heavy-duty fleet operators in order to help them make that transition to a lower carbon future. We provide consulting services to help with transition plans and help them adopt fuel cell vehicles into their fleet. HTEC is also getting into fleet services, where we will actually own, operate, and lease heavy-duty vehicles in order to help particularly smaller operators manage the enormous capital outlay that is needed in order to purchase fuel cell vehicles. We also have a final 4th division, which is our tech solutions, which works with external customers to provide customized solutions in the transportation field. But we're trying to just provide a clean, local supply that we can supply to our stations that will then be able to distribute it to both light-duty and heavy-duty vehicles and cover the whole gamut as we transition to a new future using hydrogen.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. Okay. One of the aspects which would help with the use of hydrogen in transport, particularly where, as in every case, you have to be cost effective. I think a number of our panelists have noted this. Can you speak a little bit to the low carbon fuel regulation, Mary, in terms of how that facilitates people being able to switch to cleaner transport without paying a penalty?
Absolutely. BC provides the perfect environment for us to actually develop our projects. The low carbon fuel regulation allows us with our projects. We've applied for what we call build and capacity credits, and it helps support the enormous capital expenditure that goes into putting in this infrastructure. So absolutely critical there. And then with our stations, with every molecule that is supplied into transportation vehicles displacing fossil fuels, we earn low carbon fuel credits, which again can offset the price at which we need to purchase hydrogen. Because we're not at price parity yet, we're getting there, but mechanisms such as the LCFR certainly help us bridge that gap as we move towards price parity.
I'd want to make sure to get Jessica's input on this as well, seeing as trucking is very much a low cost or cost-driven sector, a little bit different from some corporate vehicles or personal vehicles.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and often the first question that we'll get from a fleets is how much does this cost? And it is critical because their margins, like Matthew said, they're quite low, and we need to think of ways of scaling this solution. Without solutions that are economic for these fleets, they simply won't get adopted. So that's why we have a business model in which we provide our conversion kit for free to the fleets in exchange for a 5-year contract, where hydrogen is quite close to parity with diesel because of the nature of the project that we built here in Prince George. We don't have liquefaction, so it makes it a little cheaper. And it's, for us, really exciting to see the uptake from fleets, which traditionally aren't, I think, perceived as the most innovative or advanced on climate change. A lot of that has to do with just a lack of viable options. And it's exciting to see I think their enthusiasm here in Prince George in particular, where there is so much of a resource base from all of you, and interest, as Joe pointed out, Fortis has their decarbonization goals. Many of you in the audience work for companies with decarbonization goals, and you're looking at your supply chain now, not just your own emissions, and trucking is one of those sectors where there hasn't, unfortunately, been a lot of uptake of new technologies because of the costs involved. And that's really kind of the crux of it, is making sure that we're doing something that benefits the environment and is adoptable because it's safe and also cheap. Thanks, Matthew.
Super. Now, the low carbon fuel regulation provides credits for alternates to liquid fuels based on proportional to the amount of GHGs, the amount of emissions they reduce. And so Neil, with a carbon negative process for producing hydrogen, have the regulations caught up with the possibility of there being negative carbon hydrogen as a fuel?
Thanks, Matthew. For BC on the liquid side, I think the answer is largely yes, or it will be under the new act. So it uses a tool at the back end called GHGenius. GHGenius now does have biomass to energy pathways built within it, but it's a little bit different actually on the federal side. So the federal clean fuel regulation that's just come out, they use a different greenhouse gas accounting tool, or life cycle tool, I should say, OpenLCA, and that does not yet have those pathways in it. And so that's really what we're finding is again, the federal hydrogen strategy did talk to biomass to hydrogen. The provincial strategy mentions it, but it's just very brief. So I think it's interesting being a new pathway, we're sort of having to break ground with people because they weren't necessarily thinking about negative emission hydrogen, but are thinking about things like direct air capture, are thinking about other types of negative pathways that are so critical to get to and beyond net zero, but net zero fuels from biomass haven't really been thought about beyond, electricity, beyond sort of BECCS type projects, just literally burning it. And you don't capture the carbon that way. You sort of waste the carbon that the tree has been spending 250 years to capture, or agricultural residues or other types of biomass as well. And the same may be true. We'll see what happens with the new greenhouse gas reduction standard. It'll be the new rules that Fortis will have to operate under. That was part of the Clean BC roadmap. Again, at the moment, the rules that Fortis operate under envisage RNG, they envisage other types of pathways, they envisage positive or close to zero carbon intensity hydrogen, but not necessarily negative. So I think on the rules and regs, the answer is a bit of a mixed bag. And so we are having to do some work with governments to say, look, this isn't a pie in the sky anymore. This is a credible pathway. It's going to happen. And because of the extreme negativity, there's extra decarbonisation value that we need to be able to unlock.
I guess on the good side, then at least British Columbia is a little bit ahead of the federal government in at least that regard. In terms of interfacing with government and varying targets and goals, I'm sure Fortis BC does probably more engagement on different fronts with government than each of the other three parties combined corporately. Joe, would you want to speak to some of how the provincial or federal goals, policies, incentives might be moving Fortis BC forward?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, right now we're obviously focused on Clean BC, and achieving the targets in Clean BC for sure. So in the near term, that's, provincially it's 40% reductions by 2030. But BC has generally been at the forefront of energy policy. And that's, you go back to 2007, the original carbon tax, and some of the standards and regulations and standards that have come in place since then have been very, very helpful for us. I mean, there was a mention there about the greenhouse gas reduction regulation. Of course, we're able to procure renewable natural gas and hydrogen under the GGRR and integrate it into our system, which has been quite helpful. It enables utilities in BC to purchase hydrogen with certain cost production and energy volumes and then distribute it within BC. The cap itself for utilities is a challenge, but we're working our way to achieve the cap. There's also the zero emission vehicle mandate, low carbon fuel standard. Federally, there's a hydrogen tax credit. So there's lots happening, and it's helped stimulate things. I'd say longer term, I mean, we're excited about the opportunity. It was mentioned this morning, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, a real landmark piece of legislation, and a wide range of tax credits, grants, and loans. And certainly Canada is got its own investment tax credit regime that we're working on, but that's definitely something to watch because we want to make sure those projects stay in Canada, that the hydrogen economy is developed here, and that we can continue to have as cost-effective hydrogen as we can possibly get. That's really the goal.
Super, thanks. I'm going to turn to Huva. Please remember to submit and vote on questions. The top-ranked question at the moment is whether each of our panelists has any major new infrastructure projects or methodologies they're excited about. Perhaps in this case, I'll turn to Mary again first. I appreciate that there may be some confidential information that each of you has within your companies, but let's try and be either oblique or highlight someone else's project.
Certainly, I think I'll talk about my own. The first one we can certainly talk about is the announcement that was made just a few weeks ago, the liquefier, I mentioned it. So we will be establishing that in North Van, working with ERCO, using byproduct hydrogen to liquefy and create 15 tons a day of hydrogen. And that'll have a low carbon intensity using the byproduct. So it's a real opportunity, and that hydrogen's been available and been vented into the air for 50 years. So to finally be able to take advantage of it is a fantastic opportunity. It's not to say that project is without its hurdles, and it's certainly not going to be shovels in the ground tomorrow. There is permitting and regulation to get beyond, but we've initiated the first step where we have the agreement and we'll move forward. So that one's super exciting. That one's on the liquefaction front. On the electrolysis production front, yesterday at the 4 p.m. session, the minister, they actually announced the IFIT funding that we received, $10 million to develop hydrogen production through electrolysis on Vancouver Island in partnership with the Nanaimo Forest Products Harmac Pacific Mill. So that one's exciting, dear to my heart. I work on that one daily. So again, we have our site, we have our agreement, we're going forward, but it'll still be at least late to 2024 before we see, hopefully with no supply chain issues, actual production. There's a number of regulatory hurdles and permitting to get through, but again, super excited about that project to also go forward. And we have another project in Vancouver, a 1 ton per day facility that we hope to see in production in 2024 as well. So lots happening, and hydrogen at scale is coming, and soon.
Cool. Joe, perhaps maybe this would be from the acquisition of clean energy side. Are there any hydrogen activities or projects that have struck you particularly?
Yeah, sure, Matthew. The one that I'll highlight is the partnership that Fortis BC has with Suncor and Hazer. It's a pyrolysis project, and pyrolysis is essentially natural gas going into a reactor under an iron ore catalyst. Well, the catalyst we're using is iron ore, and producing hydrogen and carbon black. So carbon is essentially a solid, not going into the atmosphere. And that carbon has a market, for other carbon feedstocks, for tires, for battery anodes. There's a bunch of different things it can be used for. But pyrolysis is really, really interesting. And what it does is it allows us to produce low carbon hydrogen at scale. And we're really excited about the opportunity of that project. We made an announcement last year. And of course, the other thing with that one is we were the recipient of Clean BC funding. And we're really appreciative of the provincial government for selecting us on that, because it's really going to stimulate that project.
Yes. I guess one thing to comment about pyrolysis, it is basically turning the carbon in the methane, in the natural gas, into a solid product, into a powder. You don't create CO2 in the course of the reaction. Additionally, you don't need water for the reaction. Now, most places in BC do have a decent water table, but certainly there will be some areas, perhaps in other parts of Canada, where you may have natural gas resources and a lack of water, where pyrolysis could be very appropriate. Turning over then to Jessica, are there any particular infrastructure projects which excite you?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I know you all know already that I'm really excited about our Prince George project, so I'll talk about someone else's project instead. We're really excited about the projects that are happening across Canada due to the tax credit and other incentives to produce hydrogen in Canada. For us, we're not interested in continuing to produce hydrogen like we do in Prince George. We're using it as a template to show supply and demand coming together and looking actively for those partnerships for new announcements. And we're always scouring to see who's out there, what kind of new technologies are happening, what kind of projects are bringing scale to hydrogen production, like Steve from Fortis over here. Tons of really interesting hydrogen supply projects that are green, that are coming online. So that's what excites us the most, is to see the framework starting in Canada to rival what happened with the US and the Inflation Reduction Act, and really bring hydrogen online in a meaningful way that will create the infrastructure that we need to continue to see the demand side of the equation come to the table.
Thank you. And Neil, on your end.
I mean, I think I would answer this question perhaps a little bit differently. I mean, the market needs to develop. So we're really excited about all these different supply and demand pieces of infrastructure, but because we're coming at this a different way, there was actually some infrastructure missing from BC, and so we've actually had to move the hydrogen production hub to Alberta, and it's the CCS side. So I was actually really pleased to see the CCS Atlas come out from Geoscience BC and the Centre for Innovation and Clean Energy just this week. That's the beginning of a really important piece of work in BC to get that CCS, the actual sequestration side, the S of the CCS side, working. And then, you know, as Fortis does their work, building out the hydrogen distribution infrastructure, and HTEC with the refueling stations, the engines, you know, we need all of that to be able to actually then supply the market. So I think it's more what's coming, and hopefully what's coming in BC is those pieces, because, you know, BC already does have a competitive advantage here. We have cheap, clean electricity, we have abundant water, we have long travel distances, so it's perfect for heavy-duty trucking. It's really a great bridge for decarbonisation there, because I think battery technology will take a long time. And in our case, we have abundant forestry and an industry that's perhaps struggling a little bit. So coming up with a new market for those residuals that can underpin that primary forestry market, and get the whole tree out, get the lumber logs and the pulp logs out at the same time as you bring the residuals out, and then create an energy market that underpins that as well. All of those different pieces of infrastructure to develop these new low-carbon economic opportunities are going to be necessary.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Neil. There was a mention of partnerships here from some of the speakers. Maybe since your project is already up and running as a pilot in Prince George, Jessica, would you want to speak to the ideal partnerships or structures for hydrogen-related projects going forward in northern BC?
Sure, thanks, Matthew. For us, it was really important, of course, to get the fleets on board. A big part of that was having a business case that made sense for the fleets. And then having, I think, a presence here in Prince George so we can answer questions. We did convert a truck up here for Lomac, a fleet that does a lot of Forest Service product hauling, and then we converted another truck for Lodgewood, which unfortunately is no longer, but now we're working with some additional fleets to fill our capacity for 65 trucks at the station that I mentioned. It was quite important for us as we went down the electrolysis pathway to form a good relationship with BC Hydro. And I think one thing that wasn't mentioned yet is the rate structure that they have for hydrogen production. That's a discounted rate structure for 5 years. It's another sweetener, I think, to bring more production online faster. And then finally, the City of Prince George has been excellent to work with to walk us through the permitting steps of what's required at the local government level. And of course, we've been really appreciative of all the support that we've gotten from Chief Darlene at the Clayton Tenay and her perspective on how we can support cleaning the airshed locally in Prince George, being able to reduce diesel up to 40% in the trucks that service regionally. Because we're focused on return to base truck, that's our ideal partnership for trucks. We're looking at trucks that are going in Prince George no further than 500 kilometers and coming back again. So we are hoping to have that positive impact on the airshed locally as well.
And in general, perhaps, on the Fortis BC side, Joe, do you have any inputs on your experience with different partnerships, large capital projects I know you have had involvement with? In terms of like off-take agreements and so forth.
Yeah, we certainly, partnerships are going to be a big part of this strategy for sure. I think as we scale up the infrastructure, in many cases, we'll be looking for partners to do it with, to de-risk the projects. You know, we're no stranger to partnerships. For example, we've got a partnership with the Chemainus and Cowichan First Nations at Mount Hayes, one of the LNG facilities. We've also recently announced a partnership with Musqueam Indian Band on Tilbury. So these are things that we've done before and we continue to want to do, particularly with industry partners, with First Nations, and see it as a critical part of our strategy moving forward, frankly.
Super. Yes, certainly we want to make sure that in this generation of energy projects that we have stakeholders and rights holders equally at the table. Mary, seeing as your scope of activities covers different geographies, I think HTEC has even done international projects. Do you want to speak a bit to the ideal partnerships that you guys look to develop as you develop your own projects? Apologies again for my voice.
Certainly. Jessica touched on a really important point. BC Hydro is always a key partner on our projects in British Columbia. Their rate structure is incredibly important with the electricity costs, which when you're doing electrolysis is about 80% of your operating costs. So that's a relationship we have with all of our projects. We've identified Prince George as a key hub area. We don't have any projects in the development here, but we need to be here, and we're going to be here. So working with the city is incredibly important to establish those relationships and make sure they understand to help us navigate the permitting process. With our stations, we've certainly seen hurdles with that, because even if you develop relationships with one city or one municipality, then you move into another one, there's completely different needs and attitudes, so you need to start that relationship all over again. So obviously, City of Prince George would be critical in that. As transportation demand builds, initially when our production comes online, we won't have enough transportation demand initially to take it all. So having relationships with companies such as with Fortis to provide another offtake opportunity for our hydrogen. Can we put it into the local industry and use it as industrial heating? Can we put it in the pipeline to offset natural gas emissions for residential heating? So again, key partnerships. And then one of our stations that we are developing in Vancouver, it's on the Tsawwassen First Nations band, so working with them and having them be a partner. So those are relationships we also need to develop, especially since if we come up into the north here.
Great. And Neil, I guess having your project in the further north of BC, do you want to add anything in terms of the partnerships you've been developing to coalesce your project?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I think First Nations, I mentioned that at the beginning. The Fort Nelson First Nation are a partner for us on the forestry side, partner in terms of equity with the actual pellet plant itself. It's on traditional territory. We see that as a model that will continue to move forward as BC provides more and more tenure opportunity to First Nations, local communities as well in terms of that forestry fiber, and we hope the actual forestry companies that are out there doing the logging and have tenures and mills and trucks, et cetera, at the road now. And then, of course, the other important side of it is the actual off-takers. So for now, our project is at quite a big scale. So our first production unit will be 40,000 tons of hydrogen a year. The whole hub will be 160,000 tons of hydrogen a year. So, right now, that's too big a volume to put into a natural gas pipeline all in one go. It's probably a little bit more than Hydra and HTEC need. So we're also looking at partnerships on that offtake side. And that might be refineries, it could be petrochemical, just those big users of hydrogen who also have decarbonization goals, whether it turns into HDRD, whether it's direct hydrogen for use in the refinery process to crack the oil, and ultimately many other partnerships on the offtake side as well, we hope. And that difference, with us as well as the fuel markets, we can actually play in the carbon markets as well, because we are putting the CO2 from the trees underground. So maybe some partnerships there actually on the credit and offtake side.
Matthew, can I just, one more thing? I would certainly be remiss saying, if I overlook the partnership with government, certainly these projects we get into, they have a high capital cost, and without government support, it would not be possible, and that extends from NRCan and IFIT and Pacifican and Clean BC have all come to the table and provide enormous support for our projects.
So we have another question here from the audience about whether the PG pulp mill closure will affect your respective projects. That might be a bit too granular in either of your cases, but maybe starting with Neil then, are there advantages to being able to site on the locations of mills or industrial facilities that are no longer in use or no longer in peak use?
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. Obviously nobody likes to see industry facilities shut down. The impact on the communities, the impact on families, obviously the impact on BC more broadly. So, starting from there, when this has happened, yes, access to brownfield sites then can be helpful. Access to the tenures that they leave can be helpful, but our intention is not just to come in and replace or replicate, but actually to try and underpin and support that primary forest industry where we can. If some of those traditional uses of fiber aren't there anymore, and that's the case in Fort Nelson, the OSB mill shut down 12 years ago. There's been a few different attempts to restart that. It hasn't been successful. So if we can come in and create an industry where one was and no longer is, the advantage that maybe we bring is we're still sort of forestry at that point. So a lot of those traditional forestry jobs in the actual woods and a lot of the jobs at the actual mill sites will look fairly similar. So it's a transition opportunity for those workers into the low carbon economy. It's probably the wrong phraseology because forestry wasn't not low carbon in the first place. And the same for the potentially for oil and gas workers as well, because a lot of the technology at our hydrogen plant with being gasification, gas separation, is very similar technology than you would find in a lot of traditional oil and gas markets as well. So yeah, there are some job transition opportunities there. There are some ways of using the fiber differently, and hopefully by going back to some of these shutdown sites, we can help to reinvigorate some of those communities with the local councils, with the local First Nations, and provide the next generation of jobs if they can't be continued through the existing industry.
Sure. Okay, Mary, I think you had mentioned a mill in Nanaimo that you were possibly leveraging. Can you add color to this response about being able to leverage existing mills and infrastructure?
Absolutely. So our project on Vancouver Island is at the Nanaimo Forest Products Harmac Pacific Mill. And the production we'll put in there, it's to make it economically viable, it's absolutely critical that we can be able to work with Fortis and have the initial offtake go into the mill and offset their use of natural gas and reduce their carbon footprint while we are developing the transportation market. And ultimately, we expect the transportation market to grow substantially on Vancouver Island. Right now, our stations over there, we transport the hydrogen by ferry, and it's at really high cost, not sustainable. So having the production local there is critical, but having an initial offtake that's ready to go, where we can put our hydrogen, is critical to the economics. So.
Then building on that, since you have your offtake agreement in Prince George, Jessica, perhaps if you could touch on that, and maybe what Neil and Mary had touched on in terms of reskilling as well. I would imagine there are a lot of traditional skills required to develop or install or retrofit these kits that you use.
Thank you. It's a good question for us. We're probably the most granular in answering because we're here in Prince George. First of all, my sympathies go out to the workers that were impacted by this pulp mill closure. And also, what we know is that there's many services, of course. It's not just the workers directly, it's all the support services that PG Pulp used. And one of my concerns was for the fleets that we work with, if they were going to be impacted by this. And I think, I guess one of the silver linings going through COVID is many of the fleets that we work with got more diversified and have a lot of different clients now that they service. So it appears so far, it's early days. I've just been here for a few days and touched base with a couple of fleets, but it does seem like they're able to kind of weather the storm, I hope. And we'll continue to work with fleets on finding ways that we can to support them.
And then I guess to Joe's side, what reskilling or additional job skills or expertise do you think Fortis BC will need to add as more hydrogen does come online, as you begin blending, and I would imagine at some point handling pure hydrogen through pipelines?
Yeah, absolutely. That is important. The development of codes and standards and training programs will be really critical, and that work has started. We've been working with various organizations on developing those programs. It is early days. I think the standards and the codes are particularly important here to get that right. The energy industry spent a lot of time developing safety and advancing safety, so everything has to be set up properly. I would say that we're working in partnership with various organizations on this. One of them is with not so much the training, but just developing research and development with UBCO Okanagan. We've been working with them for the last few years, and just NRCan as well. So there's a lot of pieces to this, but ultimately training programs is going to be a really big part of this to make sure we can develop it successfully.
Thank you very much.
Matthew, if I could just add one more comment.
Oh, sure.
Partially so you don't have to talk anymore. I just wanted to add that in terms of upskilling, we do work with local mechanics here from the First Truck Centers, and we are developing a 4-day training program, 2 days on putting the kit on the truck and 2 days on taking it off. And then, of course, in construction, we need the just normal construction laborers. We're anticipating between 20 and 25 through construction, and then 5 to 6 operators when we're up and running, hopefully mid next year.
Super. I guess I will wrap up with one of the open questions we discussed beforehand, which was what role you see hydrogen playing in a net zero BC, net zero Canada. Maybe we'll just go back to our original lineup or order then. Neil, would you like to take that?
Sure. I think the answer is an incredibly important one, but in a way that we probably don't fully know or appreciate or understand yet, because obviously it's a very new market. In the short term, there's clearly opportunity to use it as a sort of direct replacement for natural gas, a direct replacement for diesel. How it actually starts to develop longer term, I think, is going to be pretty interesting. we've got a couple of targets in Canada and BC. One is 2030, one is 2050. And again, I think the answer will be very different across both of those. The advantage of the Hydra model is that they are adding their equipment onto an existing diesel truck. So that lets that truck run to the end of its natural life anyway. And we're not asking small companies, or even big companies for that matter, to replace whole trucking fleets early and incur the costs of that. It's a great opportunity to get some early reductions. Longer term, maybe it will be full hydrogen vehicles. Maybe it will be fuel cell vehicles. Again, Fortis, short term, can do a little bit of blending into pipelines. Longer term, perhaps some customized, bespoke hydrogen pipelines as well. Are we going to see large-scale industrial turnover by 2030? I doubt it. Are we going to start to see some use? I hope so. And then, to answer the question about net zero, I think that's where we see a model like ours really starting to come to fruition, because as a negative emission technology, we're actually taking the carbon from the tree, putting it underground. The hydrogen then has a different type of value proposition, because as well as just displacing a fossil fuel and coming to zero, by putting the carbon underground, you can actually start to displace some of the other emissions as well, and help the whole economy find credible and thoughtful transformation paths, rather than rushing to just, we've got to get rid of something, what do we use to get rid of it? So I think it'll be incredibly important. I think we won't know all of it for a while. So my ask to regulators is try to keep the door open for now. Let's not try to close things down too early. Let's not try to restrict things. Let's see where we get to, and then let's see what type of technologies end up coming through on the supply side, the best uses on the demand side, and then start to plug it together. But definitely direct industrial decarbonization, heavy duty trucks, and petrochemicals I see for sure as important ways to use hydrogen to get to net zero.
Super. Jessica.
Neil stole my speaking points. No, it's great, and I'm glad that there's so much understanding building for Hydra's technology being a transition solution. One thing that I did want to highlight is the number that we have of up to 40% is something that, when I started at Hydra, we were closer to 25%, and it's a number that we're continuing to improve upon. So our emissions performance gets better and better. We're starting to incorporate, for example, machine learning into the technology. It's an aspect that we don't talk about very much, but it's something that really optimizes what we do and enables us to learn faster when we're looking at a new vehicle or even a different model year. That adoption of our technology can happen a lot faster with the integration of that technology. And then I'll also point out that as much as net zero is important, I think what we've seen in the last few years, particularly with Russia and the geopolitical tensions, that it's important to think through regional economies as well, and having a diversity of supply, of which hydrogen can be part of that mix for transportation, as Neil pointed out, as well as what Fortis is doing right now in the integration of the natural gas grid.
Yeah, thank you. Just building on my fellow panelist, net zero there. Well, for us, looking at net zero, and we have done some studies on this. Initially, we studied 80% reduction by 2050 in GHG emissions, and now we're working on our net zero study. What we're finding is just the real impact that hydrogen has on net zero. It had a fairly large impact on the 80% scenario, but on the 100%, it's even larger, obviously. You start to get, like Neil was mentioning, the difficult to decarbonize sector is really important for industrial applications to go hydrogen. Transport, huge opportunity for the transportation sector. So while initially we'll be blending it into the system, we'll be doing industrial hubs. Longer term, we see these hubs being connected with infrastructure, hydrogen infrastructure to connect the various hubs. That's going to be a big part of it. The other part of it is the integration of electricity and gas, and that you start from the studies and analysis that we've looked at. Obviously, we need a pretty large electric build out, which we is going to happen. And we do support the electrification. The complementary piece of that is if we do it in a smart way by building out electricity in the right way and building out the gaseous infrastructure in the right way, we think we can get a more cost-effective solution by 2050. And our 80% reduction scenario showed $100 billion less investment if we could we don't have the net zero number yet, but it's pretty significant when you get this integration of gas and electric. You also see it with the ability of the gas system to balance, to store that gas, particularly in peak situations for seasonal storage. So while we might have a wind and solar build out, still intermittent. And when you deal with the seasonality of our system, you're going to need something like hydrogen to balance the system, to store that gas, and to be essentially generate electricity in those non-peak times. So yeah, the integration of gas and electric is really the solution, we think, and that's the path we're on.
Mary?
Touched on all the major ones. Transportation, obviously, we're going after the easy ones now, fuel cell vehicles and buses, which are commercialized, trucks, which are very near, and then there's the harder ones, which will come, rail, aviation, marine, so opportunities there. Obviously, the hard-to-abate industries, steel, cement, seeing the use of hydrogen in those industries to bring down the carbon intensity. And using it for residential heating as well. But ultimately, perhaps there's the opportunity, and this is much longer term where we do put it into, say, into the pipeline, but at some point are able to take it out and separate it and actually use that pipeline as a mechanism to actually transport the hydrogen, but then be able to pull it out and use it in the stations for transportation. So a longer term, bigger dream, perhaps.
Matthew, I might just add one final point here, which is uniquely Canadian. Like, I think hydrogen has an outsized opportunity for Canada than maybe it does for some other markets. We have abundant natural gas, we have abundant water, abundant electricity, and lots of forestry. So I think we have a unique opportunity with the feedstocks we have, the long travel distances, and the enormous coastline that has the ships, the planes, and everything else. So we could not only decarbonize our own economy on the back of hydrogen, but help decarbonize the global economy through the international shipping in particular that comes in and out of the ports. So, you know, for me, hydrogen is a massive opportunity for BC. It's a massive opportunity for Canada-wide because of the underlying resources, which is, you know, why everybody here is in the room.
Okay, thank you very much, all. I think I'll turn it back to the MC. So, yes.
I want you to join me because Matthew is the Iron Person moderator of the 2023 BC Natural Resources Forum. Matthew and your panel, thank you very much. We're going to ask you to do a group photo with Jason. And the good news, Matthew, you don't have to say anything. All you have to do is smile, buddy. And then I've got some gifts for you. And then if you don't mind staying for a few more minutes, wonderful audience, our leader, Sarah, has a couple of wrap-up comments. So once again, a big BC NRF thank you round for hydrogen. Can't wait, everybody. This is exciting. Thank you so much. Okay, photograph. Jason?
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming, for staying for our last panel. I mean, I think this is going to be a headlining panel in no time as we learn more about the opportunities ahead of us. So I would really like to thank some really key people here. So please join me in thanking the Forum Advisory Committee and the management team. And that's Melissa McRitchie, Nicole Vanderfleet, Heidi Martel, Tess Roberts, Meryl Nelson, Amrita Boudoir, Jean McCorkadale, Kevin Brown, the amazing Russell AV, Central Display, Joanne and the entire catering team, and certainly the Civic Center staff led by Lindsay and Diane. So please join me in a big round of applause for that team. And it's not too soon. Let's mark our calendars now for next year. So same week, January 16th to 18th, 2024, right here, Prince George and Lheidli-T'enneh territory. And last, a round of applause for yourselves. This was a really amazing week, very informative, and so grateful that we all could come together. So thank you. And if you enjoyed this event, we also invite you to our partner conference, which is the Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference, which will be February 27th and 28th in Nanaimo. So as that conference continues to grow its feed, it's very, there's a lot of synergies that complement this event. So at that, I will officially conclude the 20th anniversary of the BC Natural Resources Forum. So safe travels home, have a wonderful 2023, and let's all stay in touch. Thank you.